Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Price of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to check out my locals. For those that are already supporting on locals, your continued support allows me to produce content. And for those that haven't done it yet, get on locals and interact with the content that I'm producing, make recommendations, and support the channel in general. So today I'm going to do something different. I'm going to start trying to do a casual, not necessarily solitary, but likely in many cases solitary program where I just talk about content that I find interesting. Could be current events, could be history, could be whatever. So for today, I want to talk about the right. And for example, why are we stuck? So on the one hand, on the whole range of issues from, we might say, normicons on the one end to more dissident figures online, there's a sort of right-wing set of goals that people talk about wanting to achieve, but never seem to actually be able to achieve in their own lives or even on the national level. And I think part of the thing is we need to understand that something that I've been mentioning a lot lately: the distinction between declared preference and intended preference. So you might declare that you want something, but you might not actually want it. And you might do something else. So, a case in point is that the boomer cons, the trad cons have been saying for years now that, they want to have their sons and their daughters married and have children and, fight against the war against the family. But, by their declared preferences, they don't want that at all, because the amount of capital transfer that you'd have to have in order to have a family, they don't do. They assume that because they were able to, quote unquote, make it from scratch, which is a highly dubious claim in the first place, in large part because they grew up in material superabundance after the end of World War II, a sort of non-repeatable event. It's completely sui generis. And then they take that as being normative in some way and assuming that all the men that come afterwards have to be the ones that do it exactly the same way they did. Which, firstly, I would question the fact that they ever did it by themselves in the first place. For example, we can talk about the fact that the silent generation, which came before them, did a lot of paying it forward that the boomers have since obviously failed to do. That, coupled with material superabundance and a government that wasn't actively working against them in the way that young men today, where the government is actively working against them, pushing, propaganda that's anti-male and so on and so forth, we see that it's a very different struggle. And so each generation, Xers, millennials, there are some men that, quote, make it and, quote, live the boomer dream, but fewer and fewer from each generation do so. And that's in part due to the new conditions that we're living in, new conditions that they refuse to admit are the case. So that's one example. Another example might be some right-wing millennial who's like, hey, you know what? One of the things that I think is we need to have this or that. Maybe they're a, online trad cat. Maybe they're, a neo-pagan or whatever. They want to have some more traditional society. But, for all the years I've been active online, we just don't see it. We never get any closer. And they just spend all their time online as if that's somehow building the actual real life IRL institutions that we need in order to have all this. And again, in the case of the boomers, you could argue it's just, mistaken impressions, though I think at this point it's more likely that it's malevolence. The other issue, though, is let's look at the millennial. They probably don't know better, because part of where this conversation is going to go is going to take a deep dive into history, and they frankly just don't know it. And we've all, since the 90s, really been bombarded with this digital cyberspace world where we think that if we live and act in it, we do things. Well, unless you're making money, you're not doing anything. So you're basically just wasting time on this, which is, rather than doing something in real life, you're doing something online, which ends up not, unless it's making money again, you don't get anywhere. And so we see that, okay, so what is the problem here? Why is it that people have these declared and revealed preferences and never the twain shall meet? And, looking at my own life from the trad cons and, growing up in the homeschool community in the United States, they completely just crap the bed as far as goals and outcomes and so on and so forth. And then with the dissident elements that I've engaged with online as well, again, we see completely nowhere. nowhere. And what ends up happening is the society gets worse and worse off due to these broader systemic problems that they're criticizing. They just pretend that where we're at now is where they wanted to be always. They can't actually admit that they failed to achieve the goals that they had before. Now, okay, most people don't want to admit that they're wrong, but when you have this pattern of defeatism, that's a little more difficult to explain. Because let's think about a war, right? If you lose a series of battles, at some point, if you want to win the war, your army is going to have to rethink its strategy, its tactics, and its operations, and train to fight in a new way. Otherwise, you'll just be defeated. And some nations just are defeated that way. But the issue is, well, this never happens. I think part of the reason why it never happens is the threat threshold is still pretty low. Most people that have money, that have influence, can more or less get and do what they want. And so with this pretty low threat threshold, they don't feel the need to change. And then there are those that are economically disadvantaged, either because they're younger or they just didn't play the game. Well, they're too economically disadvantaged to do anything. They just have to watch from the sidelines. And so, what can they do other than just, complain and, wave placards? Not much. And I think also how you gain success now is very different from how it was when the boomers were growing up. For example, one thing is that wealth was not yet concentrated in so few hands. There was more wealth to go around, so more of it was liquid and available for people. I mean, back in 1945 to 1965, you just had to poke, the ground, and oil comes out. It's basically painless. It's easy. But a lot of that easy energy, easy resources are gone. And so with that being gone, there's less available resources or energy out there for the average guy to get. So that's one thing. The other thing is cause and effect has been blurred because of what Baudrillard talks about with simulations, the levels of simulation. So the first order simulation is a more or less faithful representation of reality. A second order simulation hides what's there. Third order simulation hides what's not there. And a fourth order simulation, the simulacrum, doesn't make reference to anything other than itself. It becomes hyper real. And hyper reality is what he defines as only referring to itself. And also it leads into a collapse of meaning, because when you say the medium is the message, that slogan for advertisers, you've then destroyed the possibility of meaning, because meaning isn't found in material things. It's found in information. It's found in this. So one of the things that I'm saying here is that it has become increasingly harder for people to identify cause and effect, in part because of the rising simulation. Now, from those of us on the right end of the spectrum, we can also see that the decades of anti-male propaganda have sunk in a lot on the right, especially with the boomer cons and trad cons with the man up, bro. Well, I mean, man up to do what, right? Ought implies can. So if you're not being given the tools necessary in order to do what is required of you, and more to the point, if you're not told how to do it and intentionally kept in the dark, as I think I've seen in my own life and in lives of others, boomers will ask you to do things, but then they won't tell you how to do it. And then when you don't do it, they say, oh, well, you're just a loser. You don't deserve what we have. You were never going to make it. So the issue then is there's that the inroads that the left has made through this broad propaganda push. Now, the other thing here is, if we look at individualism, right? So part of it is, if you look at history, and you'll see throughout history that even groups that eventually do get conquered will have numerous, revolts. Think of like the Scottish revolt in 1755 against the new Gregorian regime, the Hanoverian British dynasty by the last of the Jacobites. They could still appeal to a sort of rooted clan identity, which admittedly was no match for the professional army of the British. But the point was, though, they had this sort of bottom-up capability, this bottom-up source of resistance. We also saw this with the revolts, against the Romans in like Israel with the Maccabees not the Maccabees, later on with the Jewish revolt of 66 to 70 AD and the Bar Kokhba revolt. And so, while on the one hand, it was sort of a mismatched fight in the sense that these sort of grassroots organic institutions were crushed, they still had the ability to resist. And where it was successful was, say, for example, Arminius' Germany. So the issue then is, what that's not here anymore, right? There's no rooted base support that people can rely on and expect to have their back in a situation like this. So individualism is the main driver, right? So what individualism says is that, well, I've heard this a ton from libertarians. I used to self-identify as a libertarian for years, is that there are no group interests. There are just individual interests. Group interests don't exist. And even if you want to like force a group interest, it's pernicious. And of course, what we see today is the logical outgrowth of this thinking, where so many things are left undone that ought to be done. And then people just spend all of their discretionary time wasting time, just doing nothing, just whatever they feel like. Because, whatever I feel like is more important than the group interest, whether that be the church, organized religious body, kinship group, family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so really, all of these factors are sort of conspiring to either A, confuse people's decision-making process, or to give them new sets of values such that they don't really want to be a part of any broader group. But let's look at the stated values, right? Obviously, what makes the normie right different from the radical right in a lot of regards is method, right? If you talk to people in the dissident right, the normie right, the trad cons, the normie cons, they'd say, well, we want to have a more traditional society, maybe the 1950s, maybe further back, strong families, husband and wives having kids, and like it used to be, right? That's what they'll say. And then they have different ways of getting there. Some people think, well, we took a wrong turn with Christianity. That's the neo-pagans. Some people say we took a wrong turn with Protestantism. That's the trad cats and orthobros. Some people think we took a wrong turn with democracy, that interacts. Some people thought we took a wrong turn with the Enlightenment or even industrial civilization. And so those are differences of means. And so though the ends can be different too, but I'm just saying that what sort of makes them all right wing in general, as opposed to something else, is this sort of broad desire to go back to some sort of traditional mode of life that we all used to know as humans. And I think the first problem is, back to Baudrillard and the simulacrum, is that their understanding of what a quote traditional way of life is almost entirely mediated through movies, social media, memes, video games, rather than actually reading history or classical traditional literature, which are windows into the way life was lived before machines and digital communications. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to go back to something that never actually existed. Because what they're doing is, well, when one can commend their desire to have some more traditional society, what they don't know is what that actually looks like, one, and two, they don't actually know how to get there. And so one thing that I would say relates to this is the idea of crapshoot maxing. So in the United States, specifically after World War II, but even before that, with the increasing wealth generated by industrial capitalism, people shifted from forethought to just post hoc fixing it, right? So if you look at most of human history, except for the very wealthy or powerful empires, and even the early American Republic up until maybe the Civil War. Actually, the Civil War is a good turning point here because it's about war. So if you look at like the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the two great generals would be George Washington and Winfield Scott, both of whom were cautious, both of whom planned ahead and had, they meticulously planned out their campaigns in order to achieve victories for the American forces, in part because they knew they didn't have limitless resources to suffer brutal attrition rates or whatever. Whereas in the American Civil War, we had conscription and we had industrial production. And so we had a shift of command from the more cautious, thoughtful planning of, say, a McClellan or Thomas to Grant and Sherman's just aggressive bullheadedness. And so the idea is that, well, look, there's always going to be more men to fill the the uniform, there's always going to be more bullets produced. So we don't have to think as much about planning for these tactical operations. It becomes more logistics where you plan for production and supply than that you actually plan for tactical forces. So you get sloppy, you get clumsy. And we see the same in civilian life, right? Prior to air conditioning, you had to build houses in accordance with the environment you're living in order to keep them cool and livable in, like, say, the hot, humid climates of the South and Southwest. But what ends up happening is now you can build these, stock McHouses and fill them with air conditioners. And you don't have to worry about how you build them and airflow and keeping them cool in the summer and whatnot, because you can just, we'll just fix it later. And this whole just fix it later attitude is a complete crock. It's a joke, right? So what ends up happening is the problems never actually get fixed. You just kick the can down the road, and you have the illusion of kicking the can down the road because you have all this wealth. But again, this wealth is predicated on certain things, certain preconditions, which are being eroded exactly by this carelessness. One of those preconditions is a stable family home in order to raise well-adjusted men that can be educated and go into the workplace, which over the last 50 years, we've seen erode tremendously. So we see this as well. There's a moral hazard of wealth. So, but having said that, okay, well, they believe in a simulation of tradition. Okay, well, what would it really look like? What would a real traditional society look like? More to the point, what needs to be in place to have a family? And this is where crapshoot maxing doesn't work, because in a area of capital scarcity, which many millennials are living in, Zoomers are living in, and I think all of us will be living in the not too distant future due to various arguments I've made elsewhere on my channel, is that in a capital scarce future, you have to plan ahead, and you can't just patch it up after the fact, because there's no resources to patch it up after the fact. You just have to live with the consequences of that, full stop. And so, well, okay, how do you have a family with? So what I'm saying is there's sure things in life, right? So if you work out, you will, and you eat and you diet, you'll be healthy. It's just gonna, if you do it, it will happen. If you work for the government and don't get fired, you have job security for a long time until the government collapses or you get kicked out for wrongthink. Those are just sure things, right? There's a lot of sure things in life that the boomers were able to ride on, but millennials and Zoomers, either they don't exist anymore or they've been hidden. And so what we need to think about as people on the right is the sure thing, right? Everybody's kind of guilty of crapshoot maxing, and it doesn't work. Or rather, it used to work in the past because there was so much wealth to go around, and it's increasingly not working now. So we need to think in terms of systems. And this is, I think, where the right makes a lot of mistakes and the left is better on this. They look at things in terms of systems, specifically a Marxist analysis. They'll look at terms of capitalist structures, or you look at like radical environmentalists, and they'll look at the industrial structures and how the maintenance and propagation of those structures imposes costs on everyone. And there's a sort of structural process that is upkept, and it's in the process of upkeeping it that we have these externalities. So, for example, there used to be a phrase, even in the early 20th century, that said that the family was an institution. Now, that actually meant something. I mean, the government is an institution. You actively upkeep the government. You raise taxes. You have the police. You have education and still respect for the government. So you have all of these associated structures working together to uphold the government. And there are other institutions, corporations. That's an institution. Education is an institution. All of these things have resources in society devoted to their propagation, and people are educated and indoctrinated to support them. Whereas, as we've seen in the last 50 years, it's been the exact opposite with the family. It's been under attack at every level. And so the first thing we need to do is we need to regain the intellectual concept of the family as an institution. And what that means is people have to devote time and money to propagate and upkeep that. We also have to have people taught to respect and uphold it. Now, granted, from the point of view of being in a minority position, we can't expect the government or education structures or capitalist structures to do this. Fair enough. But the people who say that they want to do this actually have to do this. And they have to know what that means. Because as we've seen throughout history, even small but devoted groups can overcome great odds to achieve success. We could look at Christianity in the first century of the Roman Empire. We could look at the communists in the early 20th century in Russia. But we have to change how we think and how we act. So let's start with the first one, finance, right? So, for example, the government finances itself through taxation. Corporations are financed in large part through, usury and investment banking, as well as the consumption of people like us. Nobody wants to allocate money for families, right? The boomers and the Xers have been able to generate a tremendous amount of capital due to industrial capitalism. But then, besides what the government skimmed off in taxes and what they wasted in mindless, useless consumption, they didn't actually give to their children. And given that the costs of living keep going up and up and up, including the cost of having children and raising them and feeding them, there's just no way that the average millennial male is going to be able to do this. Money needs to be transferred to them. But again, all throughout human history, that was a given. It was a given that the religious community you grew up in, or the tribe that you grew up in, would give you the resources that you needed, as well as the training and education, to do what they required you to do, like have a family. So, don't hold your breath. I don't think the boomers are going to suddenly have a change of heart and give capital to the, millennials and Zoomer men. But that's what they would have to do if they actually meant what they said. The other thing that would have to happen is both men and women would have to be educated in a certain way. So one of the things is a lot of the skills that are learned in the modern age are either how to get along with people and just be a people pleaser and a schmoozer, or how to make money and, manipulate stock markets or code. None of that is relevant at all to raising a family and maintaining a household. Things like home ec, child raising, and, how husbands and wives, ought to relate to each other in a normal set of conditions is completely ignored. It's never even taught. And so you basically have people that are getting married that are basically children, even though they're sexually mature adults. And so, but they've never been, and of course, they're hyper individualist as well, even amongst the right. So they have this infantile, puerile mentality of, whatever my private interests are, the most important thing ever. And that's not at all conducive to maintaining a family. So the next problem is education. Husbands and wives, men and women, need to be educated to know how to maintain a household, because ultimately the reason why the home has collapsed is it's no longer a viable economic unit. In the 1930s, there were reports from New Dealers that even then, most people didn't spend time at home. They spent time working. They spent time socializing out of the house. The home was really ancillary to all this. So, that's the issue. And so what we need to do is we need to remember what is the actual name of economics. It's oikos nomos, household law. The point of economics and the point of the household was to produce man's daily needs. So food, clothes, and shelter. That was the whole point. We have put that out of the home to either the government or corporations under the auspices that it would be more efficient or run by experts or any sort of nonsense. But it turns out that all we've done is we've lost our independence and real autonomy in replace of the tyranny of the experts. And so we need to, as we're seeing now with the supply chain shortages as a result of COVID outbreak from China, this was kind of a disaster, because now we can't actually produce what we need. Now there will be a pivot at some point. I don't know how or when that'll happen, but if we just follow the trends out, it'll have to happen. So, there's that element. And so what we can do is what used to be the case, right, specifically for women, would be like home economics classes and training, which would be a precondition, right, in order for the woman to contribute to the household economy, but treating the home itself as an independent economic unit. Now we've moved over into the realm of a system, right? If we have the expectation that each home is going to have maybe 9 people, so 2 parents and say 7 kids, and that it needs to be self-sustaining for all relevant resources. I mean, food, clothes, and shelter. Maybe not, extreme emergencies or whatnot, but it's assuming a normal parity of life. You've got it right. Well, we do the calculations. I mean, we know how much food people are going to need to eat on a daily basis, especially growing children. We just do the calculations for that. We know, if we make your own clothes, how long they're generally expected to last, and we budget for that. And once we budget for all that, just like you would for any business, you then come up with a formula. And then, you'll have families try it out and experiment and tweak it. And once we get something that works, we then, other families start doing it. And then once you have, a web of a horizontal federation of independent, economically independent households, they can then come together to support each other in times of emergency and disaster and are otherwise self-sufficient. It's just a calculation that has to be made that no one's made yet. I mean, it's ridiculous. Talk to anybody on the right and you ask them, okay, to feed a family of 7, to clothe a family of 7 or 9 rather, how do you just do this? Nobody will tell you. But if you read, say, Xenophon and his, economics guide, he would tell you how to do that, at least in the ancient times. Obviously now it's different, but it's thinking like that we need to return to. And once we have an actionable plan and the transfer of capital to do so, families can start doing that. The next thing is the proximity question. You got to live close enough together to do this. Aristotle said in the Nicomachean Ethics that one can't know a man unless he's consumed the requisite amount of salt with him, which is a euphemism for you have to eat dinner together a lot. And so for these families to come together to create this horizontal web of mutual aid, they're going to have to live near each other to know each other. And hence the high trust. So we have that element too. The other thing is, as an outgrowth of individualism, one of the things that we're going to have is a new system of how men relate to other men and women relate to other women. So one of the things that's shockingly a well-kept secret is prior to baby formula, only women could feed children. I know that's kind of amazing that people don't know that, but yeah, their secondary sex characteristics necessitate that they're the ones that feed the children. They're the ones that have the children. They're the ones that make the clothes for the children. So what I would call euphemistically the sisterhood, there was this unspoken, well, it was spoken. It was actually rigorously enforced, but there was this informal economy outside of the cash nexus. And by cash nexus, I just mean the price exchange rate. There was no price exchange. It was just something you did as an extension of either filial or religious piety to your kinsfolk or co-religionists, where you had a web of mothers and aunts and grandmothers and sisters and young unmarried women who did all sorts of work without pay to ensure that children could live. So they were having them, they were feeding them. You had a profession called the wet nurse. You had a profession called the midwife. All of these things are gone now, but women were expected to do that so that because again, before contraceptives, yeah, I know people don't think about that either. Throughout history, you couldn't prevent conception. And so this was really a matter of necessity, because since on the assumption men and women will be having sex and that's going to lead to children, and we just can't have children starving on the street, necessity demanded this. And with a lot of technological convenience and innovation, we've deceived ourselves into thinking that we no longer need to do this. Now, on the one hand, we don't see children starving in the street. We don't see families getting formed either. So some people will say, well, in the past, poor people could have kids. Why don't they have them now? Well, they don't have them now because it's too much money. In the Middle Ages, a lot of this stuff was just done as a part of a broader sense of obligations and duties. So, there's that element there. So what you end up having then is, sorry, I just lost my train of thought for a moment. Yeah, back to this, the idea of the sisterhood. We need to get back to that. Now, of course, women are taught that, well, the best work is in the university or the career, and that they're all individuals, all of which are just completely acid to this structure. And tradcons are just as bad. They don't advocate a return to this. They don't even think that this is something that we lost. but it is something that we lost. And the other element then is the more dissonant elements on the right also don't realize it's something that we lost. What sort of got me thinking about this particular angle of the question was when I read Egil's Saga, which was an Icelandic Viking saga, where at the end, his son Thorstein is basically given everything he needs to start a life. He's been given land, livestock, servants, and a house. All he has to do is find a wife. So there's these tribal obligations to this guy, and even his father, the retired Viking raider, still helps him out in a land dispute with another adjoining tribe. And so he basically is already prepared and sent off to do what he needs to do. Now, on the other hand, there's another thing that's been lost, what I would call the manor bond. And the idea being that there was also this informal network of men relating to each other. Because right now, what we see in modernity is that man hasn't been replaced by a woman, but he's been replaced by the machine. And the machine just takes so much out of the equation that the strength, determination, grit, cunning of a man is no longer needed, at least in most cases. And so they're just replaced out of it. But what you ended up having was almost this living organism, which was constituted at a cellular level of individual men. And these men would work together to build each other's houses. Now, I'll give you an example of more recent times that approximates this. My late grandfather, when he worked at the fire department, he and his buddies all built each other houses. So they didn't have to pay for labor costs. Now, the expectation was that they would all build each other's houses, so there was an equal value exchange. But there was no money changing hands. Now, one can barely imagine that today. Maybe if you had a bunch of army buddies or police buddies that you'd known for years, you could do that. But even now, that's a lot less likely to happen than back in the day. Now, that was normative because, again, there wasn't that much money to go around. You had to do certain things just because it was the right thing to do. And society, and by implication yourself, wouldn't be able to make it. So we have that. And now, of course, that's been what's under attack the most in the last 50 years or so, the manor bond. Because what it does is it sort of, at the bottom level, those of us at the bottom of society that don't have money and don't have institutional power are just left impotent and hamstrung. There's nothing you can do at that point, right? We don't have that for like the Jacobites in Scotland, that clan identity to just rise up from the grassroots to do something. So those two need to be restored. And so that's going to lead to a whole change in how we deal with money, how we deal with manners, how we deal with education and normative roles for men and women in society. And the one thing that will go out the window is individualism, because the group interest of maintaining the manor bond and the sisterhood are going to necessarily override any individual interest. So that's not to say that individual interests can never be considered, but the idea being that if there's an irreconcilable dispute, then the individual interest would go away. Now, what does this lead to? Well, throughout history, especially classical history, we have the concept of the common good. And one of the riddles of political philosophy is how to build a system and educate the people, the men in the system, to act in the common good. So, because basically it's not just some airy-fairy, veil for your own self-interest like libertarians would have you believe, though no doubt some people act that way. It is an actual understanding that there are systems that, if put in place, are maximally beneficial to everyone involved. And you need to support and maintain those systems. Now, if they are under threat by the choices of individuals, then you're going to have to prevent the individuals from acting on those choices through any number of control measures, such as, banishment, which was common in antiquity in the Middle Ages, extreme case, civil penalties or execution. But the point is, we need to think in terms of systems. And I think this is where the left has an advantage over the right. Because let's use a war analogy, right? We could say that, well, man for man, even at the tactical level, the German army on the Eastern Front far surpassed the Red Army, far surpassed it. But at an institutional level of industrial production, manpower mobilization, the Red Army was better. And the Red Army won. Now, it suffered hellacious losses in order to win. But the institution, the structure, this broad strategic vision trumped Germany's tactical operational perspective. Many people on the right are highly performing, but they operate at the tactical or operational level, not the strategic level. They don't think in terms of systems, and they lose. We've also seen this with the Great Age of Colonization, from Columbus in 1500 to 1900 with the closing of 1890 with the closing of the American frontier. We saw many indigenous peoples fight, ferociously and heroically, but as more as individuals, more as isolated bands, more as so. For example, in the westward expansion of the United States, the Native American tribes didn't create a solid front; they were just as busy fighting each other. And so, we need to think in those higher order terms, because ultimately, that's where the struggle takes place. For example, in New England, when the Puritans were setting up in the first, say, 100 years, 1620 to 1720, one of the advantages they had over native peoples was because they had a more sophisticated society with literature, the rule of law, larger institutions, they could essentially fill political vacuums that no indigenous people was able to fill. So, for example, if we look at the Pequot War of 1638-39 and the War of King Philip in 1675, in the case of the Pequot War, all the Indian tribes neighboring the Pequot sided with the Puritans or were neutral. So they had a tremendous amount of Indian support. And the King Philip's War is about 50-50. 50% of the Indians sided with King Philip and 50% sided with the Puritans. And part of the reason why the Puritans were able to gain such a following from the Indians is they produced a supranational or supra-tribal system that allowed them to arbitrate disputes in a peaceful manner, which was more to the benefit of the tribes concerned than not. And so they were filling a void that wasn't getting filled. And conservatives and libertarians and even the dissident right are in much the same position as the Indians were in New England in the 17th century, whereas the left is in the position of the Puritans. Because even if it's a bad solution, even if it's a bad answer, like, say, Soviet-style communism, it's still filling a vacuum that the right isn't filling. And that's in part because I don't think strategically or in terms of systems. Or if they do think in terms of systems, they're engineers and computer programmers that only think about maintaining these lifeless automata of metal and silicon rather than people. Whereas if you think of people like that, and then people are these organic systems of which they're the cellular components, then that's exactly how you thought in antiquity, which is why we have the idea of the body, the corporate body, where the corporate body is composed of the individual elements of the citizen body. And so what we see in this case is that with the corporate body, so you think of it like this, the corporate body would be analogous to an information network in the sense that it's greater than the sum, the total is greater than the sum of its parts, but not in the sense of it's a lifeless organism made out of metal and silicon. It's people. And that's sort of where Hobbes gets his Leviathan example from. So we need a system of people. And the other thing is churches used to be mutual aid societies all throughout the United States, where the tithes that were taken in, a large portion of that was for mutual aid for the other parishioners, rather than now in the age of the megachurch pastor and everything's being corporatized, money's being siphoned out of the community rather than back into it. And again, churches used to know that. Not too long ago, you would see, regardless of denomination, this sort of mutual aid mentality. So we need to see changes in those areas. The other area that we need to see change in is economic production and consumption, right? The idea, I remember for the anti-globalist left, so prior to 2011, there was the whole big box store thing. It's like, well, all these externalities, jobs going overseas, inhuman working conditions. Also, we can have a cheap product, which also drives out mom and pop stores. Well, that's another thing. You're going to have to be willing to pay more for a commodity because the cheap price of the commodity is hiding a lot of externalities that are negatively affecting the stated preferences of those of us on the right. So that's going to have to be done. And I think ultimately necessity will force it to be done rather than a choice. Though I would hope that some people would do this in advance. That hope so far has been an empty one. The other thing is, we need to learn how, even as recently as World War II, there were the victory gardens. People were growing their own food to feed themselves. It was only 80 years ago that we were doing that. So the idea of having local production and local consumption is something that we need to return back to, which is again what a lot of traditional societies did. They didn't produce these things to be sold in a global market. They produced them to be consumed directly, saved for the future, and maybe sold to a neighboring city. But what that meant was a lot of the resources were kept in the community and not dispersed into the ether. So, that's something that needs to be looked at, I think, seriously. And this idea of expectations, right? Growing up as a millennial, right? We all got this, if you were a millennial as well, all got this program and you could do whatever you wanted. Oh, you could be able to be the president, you could be an astronaut, blah, blah, blah. Just do it. Well, in actual fact, that's not true. But more to the point, it shouldn't be true because there's things that need to be done and that are not being done because people were given a false hope that, oh, hey, I could escape this humdrum, community that I'm in and be, cool, like an astronaut or president or whatever, a rock star. But most people actually can't. And so they just have these, unfulfilled promises and their resentment and they're empty. Whereas if you had them, involved in a community that loved them, where they were a part of it, then they would have a much better life and they'd probably be a lot less depressed and upset. So the other thing too is the idea of commodification, where you produce something to be exchanged for another good of equal value. There are lots of things today that are commodities that should not be. So, for example, the entire economy around child provisioning, which would include childcare, is commodified. So most people can't afford to do it. But 200 years ago, that wasn't really a commodity. It was just what you did. All the things that I mentioned that the sisterhood used to do, you just did. It was your duty to do it. And so there's a whole bunch of things that have to be produced just for life to continue. That's it. You just got to do it. Otherwise, life stops. And you have to do it without getting paid. Because, no, at least without getting paid financially. Usually how it was paid for in the past was a quid pro quo that, well, when I'm old, what I'm doing for you, your children, so your children will do for me, right? So it's supposed to be this give and take. And again, the boomers broke that give and take. They just didn't give anything. So the silent generation gave, and then the generation before that gave in order to keep this loop going. But then they broke it. They stopped it. So also, for example, there's a saying in Proverbs, he who visits harlots saves up his money for another. So if you're paying for sex, if you're paying for affection, like in Japan, you can pay someone to be your girlfriend, you're just throwing money away. Like this money isn't being invested to increase capital stock. It's not being invested to improve civilization. A lot of these things you shouldn't have to pay for, but you do because everything's been commodified, which means only the rich can do it. That's also what's driven people to get into debt. And that's another aspect of why we have this breach between stated preferences and revealed preferences is debt. What ends up happening is that debt, as it says in the Proverbs, the debtor is the slave to the lender. So what you end up having is all of these people that are essentially in a kind of servitude, but they don't really admit it because one, they don't see it as servitude, and two, they live in golden cages. You can buy a lot of junk. You can buy a lot of conveniences. You're in a golden prison. And so you don't see it as a prison. You see it, as, being the best thing ever. But it's this constant pressure of debt, something that even Ben Franklin criticized in the Poor Richard's Almanac. It basically eats away at your mind. Oh, can I meet this payment? Can I meet this payment? And maybe you can't. Because ultimately, what is debt? It's sacrificing the future. It's betting on future growth, right? You're mortgaging the future for the present, which in a biological sense is death. An organism that does that dies. You have to forego the present for the future, but debt works in the exact opposite direction. And once you're sufficiently in debt and have your capital sufficiently tied up so it's not liquid, you're just kind of stuck. You're like a fly in a spider web. You can't really move now. And so that's another thing. You're going to have to get out of debt. We're going to have to find ways of economic exchange that's outside of a transaction of money. And even those things that we would sell to pay money for need to be cheaper than they actually are because of inflation and scarcity of goods due to the supply chain disruption and competition for jobs due to immigration and all of these things. So we need to think about economic production differently, economic provisioning differently. And this is why something you'll see throughout history and throughout literature, which is completely gone today, is this idea of character and virtue, right? So I've mentioned this a lot before. The idea being that you have what are called the four cardinal virtues. So prudence, courage, temperance, and justice, which basically, if you were to say, somebody might say, well, Todd, what about bad actors? What about people that just take advantage of your good faith and goodwill and just, you're throwing your energy after lost causes? Well, that's a very real risk. But that's why we have this thing called character. You can find it in history books. You can find it in novels and philosophy. The idea being that you have to figure out who's actually worth it. Somebody who will. So how do you identify somebody that will act in good faith, do the right thing when no one's watching, and won't take advantage of your goodwill and take more from you than you're giving? Well, I mean, there's a lot of things you need in place. Sometimes you actually need structures putting pressure on them, but they don't exist currently. So what can you do now? Well, you can look at their character. Now, character is observed over time, hence the Aristotle reference to eating salt with someone. But you also need to know what to look for. Well, it just turns out that the virtues, the four cardinal virtues and the three theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, are just those kinds of things that you would have to look for in order to find a person who will do the right thing when no one's watching and won't take advantage of your goodwill and will actually pay it forward to you or someone else who needs it. Now, in the modern age, that just doesn't come up. I mean, I remember growing up telling people, well, hey, because I grew up in a Christian homeschool community. Well, this person over here is cheating. This person over here is not doing what, we all know we should do. And nobody listened. It's like, why are you pointing this out? The emperor has no clothes. You're not supposed to notice that. And of course, then well, then why? Why did we move away from character and the virtues? Well, in large part because we moved away from trusting in human systems, the manor bond and the sisterhood, to the machine systems. Initially, that was industrial production, and now it's digital communications. And really, character doesn't matter. I mean, you don't have to be of good character to do that. It works whether you have good character or not. But that's because it's only one way, right? The machine just is, unless someone's operating it, it's just inert. But ultimately, it's that shifting of focus and ignoring of virtue and decency that has got us here. So a fully orbed education would be like, well, what we need is people who are taught to be virtuous, both men and women, and then more specific education. So women get more of a home ec focus, and then men get more of a political focus so that they can not only interact in their own homes with their wife and children, but also interact with other men in other households in order to build a horizontal web of mutual aid between autonomous, self-sufficient houses. Now, if all of that were done, a massive task, we would finally begin to see the revealed preferences of many on the right coming true. Because you can't replace something with nothing. And I've seen this all across the spectrum with normie cons, boomer cons, trad cons, even the dissident right. There'll be things that the world offers or provides that they don't like, but they don't have anything to replace it with. And so it's sort of like something versus nothing. That's not how it works. You have to have something else to replace it with. Now, you could say from a traditional right-wing perspective, a family and children is objectively better than whatever X the world is giving you, which I would agree, but you're not getting that, and you're not likely to get it. So the world's ersatz often seems to be a better deal until it doesn't. And that's usually how ersatz, deception works. It's better until it's not. But most people aren't thinking that far ahead. And so we need to radically rethink that. And also, if we're dependent on the financial institutions, think about how the Canadian truckers had their assets frozen and they ended the protests against Trudeau. Well, that wouldn't have happened to get the money out of the banks, but they kept them in the banks to make a passive income. What do you know? The other thing is entertainment, right? All the entertainment's coming from Hollywood and Nashville and all these big megacorps. Whatever happened to, local bands where people played music for each other or like socialized and, played baseball or had dinner at a church potluck. That doesn't happen anymore. So if you want to be entertained or have social interaction, you got to go to where the world is, because there really isn't this alternative being produced by people on the right. So you need to see more of that as well. And ultimately, what needs to happen is there needs to be this realization that whatever America was, it isn't that anymore. What we do have now is essentially unaccountable tyranny from financial institutions, tech institutions, and we need to get out from underneath their thumb. Now, so think of like the early church in the Roman Empire, right? As much as possible, they relied on each other, not the institutions of Rome, because of course Rome was persecuting them. And if they relied on the institutions of Rome beyond more than they had to, that would be used to leverage over them. And so that's what we've seen with the right, Is they have, especially with boomers and Xers, they have money tied up and they have businesses. So why do you think all these social victories of the left have been won? Well, one of the things that the libertarians used to say was, well, capitalism helped, but then segregation and apartheid, because basically they wanted to have more people consumers, more people buying their products. Which, yeah, sure, as far as it goes, that's probably true. But all these other social issues, these conservative business owners continually cave on because they can't afford to lose the consumer customer base, because we're already operating on really thin margins. And so if somebody comes out as, trans, well, okay, I guess we just got to go with that. We can't lose our, our base. And so again, they're dependent on the country on the outside, not on themselves. And so they're let along by the nose because there's these financial pressures to do so. So there needs to be more of this turning inward that goes on. The other thing about virtue and character that's important is we're gonna have about a high trust society where we rely and trust on each other implicitly. And I mean, looking at boomers, they can't get along with anybody, least of all each other. And part of it is, this educational brainwashing of individualism, and you're worth it, you're the best, you're awesome, blah, 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 which has only gotten worse for each succeeding generation. But they're the ones that got the ball rolling, right? Because the silent generation, you could argue, had a more of a sacrificial attitude growing up in the Great Depression and World War II. But the idea, though, here is we need to, instead of talking about maximizing the individual and individual preferences and individual choices, we need to think in terms of these or what I might call living institutions, family, the churches, organized religion, the Männerbund, the sisterhood. Those are the things that have demands that are placed on us. And it's their continued maintenance that we ought to strive for in order to have a way of life that is off the grid, so to speak, so we're not dependent upon these unaccountable institutions that are run by progressives and against our interests. And so we can actually get along with each other long enough to actually make this happen. For those who either don't have the historical knowledge or do only in a very limited way, the way all of these institutions would look would actually be a lot like the army. Because what ends up happening in the army is, you have these guys be like, well, we're serving some higher goal, in this case, national defense. We don't necessarily like each other on a personal level, but we'll shelve that for the sake of the greater good and work together and fall in line. And then the ego is suppressed in order to serve the greater good. Now, of course, that's somewhat disanalogous, because I'm not saying these institutions are made for fighting war, but it's the closest thing we have today to anything like that mindset. And it's really that we need to recover. And we're about the end of the hour. So this is my first episode of the Casual Stream, where I'm probably going to usually go it alone. I mean, if any guest wants to come on, I'm sure we can make something for that. But I feel like that, the Monday slot is, for our circles, is not really filled very much. Competing on the weekend, there's more ensconced creators that are probably going to take up the airwaves. So we'll see how this goes. And for all those that have come on and watched, thanks a lot. And we'll see what comes up next week. It's Todd Lewis of the Praise of Flight podcast, signing off.